The hall looked like something from another world. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, reflecting gently off crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Every table was dressed in perfect white cloth, decorated with flowers that smelled faint but fresh. People arrived dressed in expensive clothes, their voices low but confident, their laughter controlled. It was the kind of place where everything felt important and everyone seemed to belong, except her. She moved quietly between the tables, carrying trays with steady hands. Her steps were careful, almost practiced, as if she had learned long ago how not to be noticed. To the guests, she was just part of the service, someone who appeared when needed and disappeared just as quickly. Most people didn't look at her face. They spoke to her without making eye contact, their attention already drifting back to their conversations. She didn't mind, or at least she had learned not to show that she did. Her uniform was clean but worn at the edges. It had been washed so many times that the fabric had lost its original softness. Still, she made sure it looked neat. Her hair was tied back simply, and there was always a calm expression on her face, even during the busiest hours. She had trained herself to stay quiet, to stay focused. This job was not about being seen. It was about surviving. But sometimes, when no one was calling her, when there was a small pause between orders, her eyes would drift across the room, to the far corner where the grand piano stood. It was impossible to ignore. The piano was black and glossy, standing under a soft spotlight as if it had its own place of honor. It wasn't just an instrument. It felt like something alive, something waiting. Guests admired it when they first arrived, sometimes taking pictures near it. And every evening, a professional pianist would sit there and fill the room with music that matched the elegance of everything around. She always listened. Even when she was moving between tables, even when someone was asking for something, a part of her attention stayed with the music. She didn't turn her head, didn't stop working, but she heard every note. Sometimes her fingers would twitch slightly, as if they remembered something her mind tried to keep hidden. Tonight was no different. The hall was full, maybe even more crowded than usual. A special event was taking place. The guests seemed more important, more demanding. Their voices carried a sharper edge, their expectations higher. She had been on her feet for hours already, moving faster than usual, but still with that same quiet grace. A man at one table raised his hand slightly, not even looking at her, and she was already walking toward him before he spoke. Another table needed refilling. Someone else asked for a different dish. The rhythm of her work never stopped. But something felt off. She noticed it slowly at first. The usual music that filled the room was missing. There was no soft melody in the background, no gentle sound to smooth over the conversations. First, she thought maybe she just hadn't heard it yet. But as the minutes passed, the silence became more noticeable. Guests began to shift in their seats. Some looked around, confused. A few exchanged quiet comments. The absence of music didn't seem like a big thing, but in a place like this, it changed everything. The atmosphere felt incomplete, like something important had been forgotten. Near the piano, a small group of staff members stood together, speaking in low, hurried voices. She passed by them once, catching only a few words. "Not here yet. Traffic delay. What do we do now?" She understood immediately. The pianist hadn't arrived. It shouldn't have mattered so much, but here it did. Everything in this place depended on perfection. Even a small mistake felt big. She continued working, but her attention kept pulling back toward the piano. It stood there, silent now, almost out of place without someone playing it. The spotlight still shone on it, but instead of looking grand, it now looked waiting. As she cleared a table nearby, she felt something strange. Not fear exactly, not even nervousness. It was more like a quiet pull, something deep inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. She ignored it. There was no reason to think about it. That part of her life was gone. It had been gone for years. She picked up a tray and turned away, focusing again on her work. But the feeling didn't disappear. It followed her. She moved from one table to another, but her thoughts were no longer fully present. The silence in the room seemed louder now, almost pressing against her ears. She could feel the tension growing among the guests, even if no one said it directly. A man at one table made a small joke about the missing music. A few people laughed, but it sounded forced. She kept her head down. As she walked past the piano again, closer this time, she slowed just a little. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to look at it properly. The surface reflected the lights above. The keys were perfectly clean, untouched. It looked exactly the same as always, but tonight, it felt different. For a brief moment, she imagined what it would feel like to sit there. The thought came suddenly, without warning. Her hands tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. No, she pushed the thought away immediately. That was not her place anymore. Maybe it never really was. Life had changed too much. Dreams like that didn't survive in the real world she lived in now. There were bills to pay, responsibilities she couldn't escape. Music had been something else. A different life, one that didn't belong to her anymore. She took a step forward, then another, but something made her glance back. It was quick, almost automatic. And in that one small glance, something shifted inside her again. Not fully, not enough to change anything yet, but enough to remind her that the part of her she had buried wasn't completely gone. She looked away quickly and continued walking. A guest called her from across the room, asking for assistance. She nodded and moved toward them, her expression calm, her movements controlled as always. From the outside, nothing had changed. She was still just a waitress in a crowded, elegant hall, doing her job like she did every night. But inside, something had begun to stir, and even she didn't fully understand it yet. The silence in the hall did not go away. If anything, it grew heavier with every passing minute. People tried to continue their conversations, but something felt missing. The soft music that usually filled the space had always made everything feel smooth, almost effortless. Without it, every small sound stood out. The clink of glasses, the scraping of chairs, the low hum of voices trying too hard to stay relaxed. She noticed it in the way guests shifted in their seats. Some checked their watches. Others looked toward the corner where the piano stood, still untouched under its gentle light. A few even whispered to the staff passing by, asking quiet questions. She kept moving just like before, tray in hand, steps steady, eyes focused. But now, she was more aware of that corner than ever. Near the service area, two staff members were speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "They're getting restless," one said. "What can we do?" "He's still not here," the other replied. "There has to be something. This can't go on like this." Their voices faded as she walked past, but the meaning stayed with her. The problem wasn't going away. It was growing. At one table, a guest laughed loudly, but it didn't sound natural. It felt forced, like he was trying to fill the silence himself. Others joined in, but the laughter ended quickly. The emptiness returned just as fast. She placed a glass gently in front of a guest and turned to leave, but then she heard it. "Maybe she can play." The words were spoken casually, almost like a joke. She paused for just a second, not turning around. "Who?" another voice asked. "The waitress. She's been walking near the piano all night. Maybe she knows something." A few people chuckled. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it wasn't kind either. It was the kind that didn't expect anything serious. She continued walking as if she hadn't heard anything. Her face stayed calm, her steps unchanged. But inside, her heart gave a small, sudden beat. It didn't stop there. As she passed another table, someone else picked up the same idea. Honestly, at this point, anyone playing would be better than this silence. More quiet laughter followed. She kept her eyes down. She knew how these moments worked. People said things without thinking. To them, it was harmless. To her, it was something else. She reached the side of the hall and set the tray down for a moment, taking a slow breath. Her hands felt steady, but there was something deeper moving under the surface. She had spent years learning how to stay invisible in places like this. Drawing attention was never part of her job. It was something to avoid. But tonight, attention was slowly finding her anyway. One of the senior staff members approached her. His expression was tight, controlled, but she could see the stress behind it. "Have you heard anything from the front?" he asked another worker nearby. "No. Still nothing." He exhaled quietly, then turned his eyes toward the piano. For a moment he said nothing. Then his gaze shifted to her. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough to make her uneasy. "You," he said, stepping a little closer. "You've worked here long enough. Do you play?" The question came suddenly, without warning. She shook her head almost immediately. "No," she replied softly. It wasn't exactly a lie. Not anymore. He studied her for a second, as if trying to read something in her face. Then he gave a small nod, more to himself than to her. "All right," he said. "Get back to work." She did. But now everything felt different. The idea had been spoken out loud. Not just by guests, but by someone from the staff. It had turned from a passing joke into something real, even if only for a moment. She moved between tables again, but her thoughts were no longer steady. They drifted, pulled back again and again to the same place. The piano, the keys, the sound it could make. She tried to focus on her tasks. A glass here, plate there, a quiet yes or of course when someone asked for something. But her mind kept slipping. Another comment reached her ears as she passed a group near the center of the hall. "Honestly, just let someone try. What's the worst that could happen?" "It would probably be a disaster," someone replied, laughing lightly. "At least it would be entertaining." She walked past them, her expression unchanged. But something about those words stayed with her. A disaster. Maybe they were right. What if she tried and failed? What if her hands didn't remember what they once knew? What if the sound came out wrong, broken, empty? She tightened her grip on the tray again. No, it wasn't even an option. She wasn't here for that. She was here to work, to earn, to get through another night like all the others. Still, as she passed the piano once more, her steps slowed again, just slightly. This time she was closer than before, close enough to see her reflection in the polished surface. For a brief moment, she looked at it. It didn't look like the person she remembered. That person had been different, more certain, more alive in a way she couldn't explain now. She looked away quickly. A sudden clatter broke the moment. A glass slipping from someone's hand at a nearby table. It didn't shatter, but the sound was sharp enough to draw attention. A few guests turned, their expressions annoyed. She moved quickly to handle it, cleaning up with practiced ease. But even as she worked, she could feel the eyes of the room drifting more often toward the silent piano. The pressure was building, not just for the staff but somehow, for her too. As she finished cleaning, she stood up straight again, smoothing her uniform slightly. Her breathing was calm, but her thoughts were not. The silence returned once more, heavier than before. And then, from somewhere behind her, a voice spoke again, clear enough for others to hear. Let her try. This time there was no laughter, just a pause, a real one. She froze for the smallest moment. Then slowly, she turned her head. A few people were looking at her now. Not many, but enough. Noticing, waiting, expecting something, even if they didn't fully believe in it. Her heart beat a little faster. She could feel it now, that quiet pull from before, stronger than it had been all night. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forcing her. It was simply there, waiting, just like the piano. She stood there for a second longer than she should have, then quickly looked away and took a step back, returning to her work as if nothing had happened. But something had. The room had changed, and so had she, even if no one fully realized it yet. The room did not return to normal after that moment. Even though people tried to continue as before, something had shifted in the air. The silence now felt sharper, more noticeable, like everyone was quietly waiting for something to happen, even if they didn't admit it. She moved again between the tables, but her steps were no longer as steady as before. On the outside, nothing looked different. Her posture was straight, her face calm, her movements careful. But inside, her thoughts were no longer under control. The words echoed again in her mind. Let her try. It had sounded simple when spoken, almost harmless. but now it felt heavy. She picked up a tray from the side table and walked toward a group of guests. One of them thanked her without really looking at her. Another continued talking about something important, something distant from her world. Their voices blended together, but she barely heard them. Her attention kept drifting. Back to the piano. Back to that quiet pull she could no longer ignore. She had spent years pushing it away. Years telling herself that part of her life was over. It had been easier that way. Safer. When you stop hoping, you stop getting hurt. But tonight, hope was not asking for permission. It was slowly rising on its own. She placed the tray down and turned, ready to walk back again, but her feet didn't move right away. For a brief moment, she just stood there, listening, not to the room but to herself. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. It was such a small movement, but it carried something deep with it. A memory, a feeling, something her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. She took a slow breath, then forced herself to move. This wasn't her place. Couldn't be. She walked back toward the service area, trying to focus on something simple, something real. Glasses needed to be cleaned. Orders needed to be checked. There were things she could control, but the silence followed her, and so did the feeling. Near the back, she paused again, resting her hands lightly against the edge of a table. Her head lowered slightly, just for a second. Why now? Why after all this time? She didn't have an answer. A voice pulled her out of her thoughts. You're distracted. She looked up quickly. One of the older staff members stood nearby, watching her carefully. Not unkindly, but with concern. I'm fine, she replied quietly. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Stay focused, he said gently, then walked away. She nodded, even though he was no longer looking. Stay focused. Yes, that's what she needed to do. She straightened herself and picked up another tray. This time, she moved faster, forcing her mind back into the rhythm of work. Step, serve, turn, repeat. For a few minutes it worked. Then she passed the piano again. This time something stopped her. Not completely, just enough to slow her down. Someone was standing near it now. A guest, looking at the keys, tapping one lightly with a finger. The sound that came out was soft but clear. A single note. It echoed gently through the room. The guest laughed lightly. See? Even I can play something, he said to the people around him. A few smiled, but the sound lingered. That one note felt like a door opening just a little. Her breath caught slightly. Without thinking, she took a small step closer, then stopped. What was she doing? She looked around quickly. No one was paying full attention to her. Conversations had picked up again, but they still carried that restless energy. The guest stepped away from the piano, losing interest just as quickly as he had gained it. The instrument was left alone again, waiting. She stood there, just a few steps away now. Her heart began to beat faster. She could hear it clearly. This was the moment to walk away, to turn around and continue working, to forget everything. But her feet didn't move. Instead, her hand tightened slightly around the cloth she was holding. Her eyes fixed on the keys. White and black. Silent again. Her mind filled with questions. What if she just touched it? Not played. Not performed. Just touched. Just to feel it once more. Would that really change anything? It was such a small thing. So simple. And yet, it felt impossible. She swallowed slowly. Another glance around the room. Still no one watching her directly. But it wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. The part of her she had buried. The part that was now asking quietly but firmly to be heard. Her hand lifted slightly, then stopped in midair. Fear came suddenly. What if everything was gone? What if her fingers didn't remember? What if the sound that came out was empty? Worse, what if it meant something? She lowered her hand again. Her chest rose and fell slowly. No, she couldn't do this. Not here. Not like this. She took a step back. Then another, almost escaping the moment. But then, another voice, closer this time. Go on. She turned slightly. A guest stood a few feet away, watching her with a curious expression. Not mocking, not serious, just interested. You were looking at it all night, he added. She shook her head quickly. I'm just working, she said softly. He smiled faintly. Doesn't mean you can't try. Others nearby began to notice now. Not a crowd. Not yet. But enough. Enough to make her feel seen. Her heart pounded harder. This was no longer a private moment. This was real. She could walk away. She should walk away. That would be the safe choice. The right choice. But something inside her refused to move. Instead, she turned slowly back toward the piano. Her steps were careful, measured. Each one felt heavier than the last. The distance was small, but it felt like crossing into another world. She reached the bench, stood beside it. Her hands felt cold now, her breathing shallow. For a moment, she simply looked at the keys. Up close they felt different, familiar, and distant at the same time. She hesitated. Then very slowly, she placed the tray down on the floor beside her. The soft sound of it touching the ground seemed louder than it should have been. A few more heads turned. The room was beginning to notice, but she no longer looked around. Her focus was fixed. Her hand lifted again. This time it didn't stop. Slowly, gently, her fingers moved forward, and finally, they touched the keys. Just a light contact, barely a press, but enough. A soft note slipped into the air. Clear, pure, alive. She froze. Her eyes widened just slightly. The sound lingered for a second, then faded. But something had already changed. The fear didn't disappear, but it shifted into something else, something deeper. Her fingers remained where they were, resting, remembering, and for the first time in years, she didn't pull them away. The note she touched did not disappear right away. It seemed to float gently through the air, soft but clear, like it had been waiting for its moment. For a second, nothing else moved. Even the quiet conversations nearby paused without anyone fully realizing it. She kept her fingers resting on the keys, as if afraid that moving them would break something fragile. Her heart was beating fast now. She could feel it in her chest, in her hands, even in the tips of her fingers. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The room had started to notice. At first, it was only a few people. Those closest to the piano turned their heads slightly, curious about the soft sound that didn't belong to the silence. Then more eyes followed. Conversations slowed. Words faded. She could feel it without looking. Tension. Real attention. Her instinct told her to stop, to step away before it became too much. Before someone said something that would pull her back into the place she knew, the safe place where she wasn't seen. But her fingers didn't move. Instead, they pressed down again. Another note. This one a little more certain. It followed the first, not perfectly but naturally, like a memory finding its way back step by step. She swallowed slowly. Her body felt tense, but her hands were beginning to relax. She shifted slightly, sitting down on the bench without thinking too much about it. The movement was small, but it changed everything. Now she wasn't just someone passing by. She was part of the moment. A few more people turned fully toward her. Someone stopped mid-sentence. A glass paused halfway to someone's lips. The room was changing. She took a quiet breath and let her fingers move again. This time, not just a single note. A small sequence. Simple, careful, but connected. The sound grew just a little, enough to carry across the nearest tables. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. There was something in it that made people listen. She kept her eyes lowered, focused only on the keys. She didn't want to see the faces. Not yet. That would make it too real. Her fingers moved again. A little faster now. Still gentle, still cautious, but there was a flow starting to form. Something inside her was waking up, stretching after a long sleep. The notes began to link together more smoothly, one after another. A quiet melody. It wasn't perfect. There were small pauses, tiny hesitations. But those didn't matter. In fact, they made it feel more real, more human. Around her, The room had grown almost completely silent. The earlier restlessness was gone. No one laughed now. No one whispered. They listened. A man who had been speaking loudly earlier now leaned back in his chair, his expression changing slowly. A woman who had been checking her phone lowered it without realizing. Even the staff in the distance paused for a moment, their attention pulled toward the sound. She didn't see any of it. She only felt the music. It was coming back. Not all at once. Not perfectly, but enough. Her fingers began to move with more confidence. The hesitation started to fade, replaced by something softer, something deeper. It wasn't just about remembering notes. It was about feeling them again. And she did. Each sound carried something with it. A quiet emotion. A memory she couldn't fully name. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, honest. That's what made it powerful. The melody grew slightly stronger now, filling more of the room. It wrapped around the silence instead of breaking it. It didn't demand attention. It earned it. Someone near the back leaned forward, resting their elbows on the table. Another person closed their eyes for a brief second, as if trying to hold onto the moment. No one spoke. They didn't need to. She shifted her hands slightly, moving into a new part of the melody. This time there was no hesitation at all. Her fingers flowed more naturally, like they had found their place again. The fear that had held her back earlier was still there, but it had softened. It no longer controlled her. In its place was something else. Connection. To the music. To herself. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The noise. The expectations. The distance between her and the people around her. None of it mattered. There was only the sound. Only the movement of her hands. Only the feeling she had thought she lost. The melody slowed slightly, becoming softer again. Not because she couldn't continue, but because it felt right. Like the music itself was breathing. A few people in the room exchanged quiet glances. Not confused, not amused, but moved. Something about this moment felt different from anything they had expected tonight. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't rehearsed. And that's what made it real. She pressed a few final notes, letting them linger just a little longer than the others. Then slowly, she stopped. Her hands remained on the keys for a second, then lifted. The last note faded gently into the air. And just like that, the room was silent again. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something no one could easily explain. She stayed still, her eyes still lowered, her breathing steady but deep. For a moment nothing happened. No applause. No immediate reaction. Just stillness. As if no one wanted to break what had just happened. Then slowly, someone exhaled. Another shifted in their seat. The world began to return. But not completely, because something had changed. Not just in the room, but in her. She sat there quietly, her hands resting in her lap now. Unsure of what would come next. But certain of one thing. She had not lost it. Not completely. And maybe, she never had. For a few long seconds after the last note faded, no one moved. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels empty. It felt full, almost heavy, like the room itself was holding on to something that had just passed through it. People looked at one another, but no one spoke. It was as if they were waiting, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. She sat still at the piano, her hands now resting in her lap. Her fingers felt warm, almost unfamiliar after being still for so long and then suddenly alive again. Her breathing was calm, but deep, like she had just come back from somewhere far away. She didn't look up right away. Part of her was afraid to, because the moment she did, everything would become real again. The room, the people, the difference between her and them, it would all return. But she couldn't stay there forever. Slowly, she lifted her head. The first thing she noticed was not the faces. It was the stillness. Every table had gone quiet. Conversations had stopped completely. Even the staff in the distance stood frozen. Their usual movements paused. Then she saw the eyes. They were all on her. Not in the way she was used to. Not passing, not ignoring. This was different. They were really looking. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed something softer, something like respect. A few looked confused, as if they couldn't match what they had just heard with the person sitting in front of them. She swallowed gently. This was the part she didn't know how to handle. Being invisible had always been easier. But now there was no hiding. A small sound broke the silence. A single clap came from somewhere near the front. Soft, careful, as if the person wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. Then another clap followed. And another. Within seconds, the sound spread across the room. Applause. Not loud at first, but real. It grew steadily, filling the space that had once been empty. Some people clapped slowly, thoughtfully. Others with more energy but still controlled, still respectful. She felt her chest tighten slightly. She wasn't used to this. Not anymore. Her instinct told her to stand up and leave quickly. To return to her role, to disappear before anyone said anything more. But her body didn't move. She remained seated for a moment longer, unsure. Then quietly she stood. The applause continued. She gave a small nod. Not a performance gesture, just a simple acknowledgement, and stepped away from the piano. As soon as she moved, the feeling shifted again. Reality returned. The distance between her and the guests became clear once more. She bent slightly to pick up the tray she had left beside the bench. Her hands moved carefully, as if she was trying to return to something familiar. The applause began to fade, not because people lost interest, but because the moment had passed. But the attention did not disappear. Not completely. As she turned to walk away, a voice called out, "Wait!" She stopped. Slowly, she turned back. A man stood from one of the nearby tables. His expression was serious, but not harsh. He took a few steps closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "That wasn't ordinary," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something in it. Something honest. She didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. A few others leaned slightly forward, listening. "You've played before," he added. It wasn't a question. She hesitated. Her first instinct was to deny it again, to keep things simple, to close the door that had just opened. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he asked, or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long while, someone wasn't looking at her as just a waitress. She lowered her eyes briefly. "A long time ago," she said softly. The room stayed quiet. No one interrupted. "What happened?" someone else asked gently from another table. The question hung in the air. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't rude. But it was personal. She shifted her weight slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke. "Life," she said simply. A few people exchanged glances. It wasn't a full explanation, but it was enough. Enough to understand that there was more behind it. More than just a simple story. The man who had spoken first nodded slowly, as if he understood without needing details. "That kind of playing doesn't disappear," he said. "Even after years." She didn't reply, because she didn't know if that was true, or if tonight had just been something rare, something that wouldn't come again. Another voice spoke, this time softer. "You should be playing, not serving tables." The words were kind, but they carried weight. She felt it immediately, and with it came something else. Doubt. Because the world wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about talent. It never had been. She gave a small, polite shake of her head. "This is my work," she said quietly. No one argued right away, but the idea had been planted. It moved through the room, unspoken but present. People began to look at her differently now. Not just with curiosity, but with interest, with questions. She felt it in the way their eyes followed her as she stepped back. In the way their expressions had changed. It made her uncomfortable. Not because it was negative, but because it was unfamiliar. She turned and began to walk again, returning to the space where she belonged. Or at least where she believed she did. Her steps were steady, but her thoughts were not. Behind her, the piano remained silent once more. But it no longer felt forgotten. And neither did she. As she reached the service area, One of the staff members approached her quickly. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low but filled with surprise. She looked at him briefly. "I just played," she said. He stared at her for a second, then shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. "Well," he muttered, "you should have said something earlier." She didn't answer, because she didn't know how to explain it. How do you explain something you thought you had lost? Something you didn't even allow yourself to think about anymore? She picked up another tray, her hands moving automatically again. But now everything felt different. Not the work, not the place, but her. The part of her she had pushed aside for so long was no longer quiet. It had spoken, and now it refused to be ignored. As she stepped back into the hall once more, she could feel the eyes again, watching, remembering, waiting, and somewhere deep inside her, a small, uncertain thought began to grow. What if this wasn't the end of something? What if it was the beginning? The rest of the evening did not return to the way it had been before. Even though people slowly went back to their conversations, even though the sound of plates and glasses filled the air again, something quiet had changed beneath it all. The hall still looked the same. The lights still glowed softly. The tables were still perfect. But the feeling inside the room was no longer untouched, and she could feel it with every step she took. As she moved between the tables again, carrying trays and responding to requests, the work itself did not change. But the way people looked at her did. Their eyes no longer passed over her. They paused. They followed. Some even smiled slightly when she came near, as if they were seeing her for the first time. It made her unsure where to look. She kept her gaze low, focusing on her tasks. That was what she knew. That was what felt safe. But inside, her thoughts were moving in ways she couldn't control anymore. Her fingers still remembered the feeling of the keys. Even now, as she held a glass or adjusted a plate, there was a faint echo of that moment. The way the notes had come back. The way the music had filled the silence. She had not imagined it. It had been real, and that truth stayed with her. At one table, a guest gently stopped her before she could leave. "That was beautiful," the woman said softly. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. She nodded slightly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quiet. The woman didn't say anything more, but her expression said enough. As she walked away, something shifted again inside her. Not fear this time, but something softer. Something like acceptance. Near the center of the hall, the man who had spoken earlier was still seated. But now he watched her more closely. When she passed by, he stood again. "Excuse me," he said. She stopped, turning toward him. "I meant what I said before," he continued. "You shouldn't let that go." His tone was steady, not pushy, but firm. She held the tray a little tighter. "It's not that simple," she said. He nodded as if he expected that answer. "Maybe not," he replied. "But it's not impossible either." She didn't respond right away, because part of her wanted to believe him, and another part didn't know how. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he added. "But don't forget what just happened." Those words stayed with her. Don't forget. As if she could. She gave a small nod and continued walking. The hours passed slowly after that. The event began to wind down. Guests started leaving one by one, their voices softer now, their movements less rushed. Some glanced toward the piano as they walked out. Others looked at her again, as if trying to connect the moment they had experienced with the person they saw now. She stayed quiet. She worked until the last table was cleared, until the last guest had gone, until the hall began to return to its empty state. When it was finally over, the staff moved more freely. Jackets were loosened. Voices became more natural. The pressure of the night faded. She collected the last few items from a table and carried them toward the back. Her steps were slower now, not from exhaustion alone, but from thought. Too many thoughts. When she returned to the hall, it was almost empty. Only a few lights remained on. The grand piano still stood in its place. Silent again, but no longer distant. She looked at it from across the room. For a long moment, she didn't move. No guests. No expectations. No eyes watching her. Just her. And that quiet space. Her steps carried her forward without much thought. Slowly, calmly, she stopped in front of the piano once more. This time, there was no hesitation. No fear of being seen. She sat down gently on the bench. Her hands rested in her lap for a second. Then, without rushing, she lifted them and placed her fingers on the keys again. No audience. No pressure. Just a soft breath. And then, a note. Then another. The sound filled the empty hall differently now. It echoed slightly, spreading wider without voices to interrupt it. She played quietly, not to prove anything, not for anyone else, just for herself. The melody came easier this time. Not perfect, not complex, but real. Each note felt lighter, freer, as if it no longer had to fight to be heard. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that moment, everything became simple again. Not easy, but clear. This was still a part of her. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how much life had changed. She finished the short melody and let her hands rest once more. A soft exhale left her lips. She opened her eyes slowly. The hall remained still, but she didn't feel small in it anymore. She stood up, looking at the piano one last time. There was no dramatic decision, no sudden change, just a quiet understanding. Something had begun tonight. Not a complete transformation, not a perfect ending, but a beginning, and sometimes that was enough. She picked up her things and turned toward the exit. Her steps were the same as before, calm, steady, but something inside her had shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but deeply, and as she walked out into the cool night air, the world didn't look different, but she did, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like hope.